Thanks, Rosemary, for a really nice introduction. Okay, I'm not a fan of the mic, so if it's bothering you or me, just let me know, because it seems to be echoing in my ears. All right, so you've got me for the next 4 mornings. We have a 45-minute slot with 15 minutes for questions. I'm quite relaxed. If you want to ask questions as we go along, please do so, because often I find then you might forget them later on, and that would be terrible. But I'm also quite happy to take questions towards the end afterwards as well. If I think that what you're asking me I'm going to cover in the coming slides, then I will just also indicate to you that I'd like to hold that question, if that's okay. All right, let's get straight into it. So yesterday you had Rahima lecture you about what is a circadian clock. These are the 4 lectures we're doing for the next 4 mornings. So this morning we're looking at circadian rhythms in humans. So we're moving from the plant to the human model, and we're going to look at resonance and disruption within these rhythms. So we'll take a look at the biology of the rhythms. We'll look at how they're controlled, how they're expressed through our bodily functions, how they're expressed through our behaviour, which I think is a really critical aspect, and then how we tend to disrupt our rhythms. All right, so before I start, I'd just like to have a couple of terms in place. As mentioned in the introduction, this is in the field of what we call chronobiology, chrono obviously referring to time. And so this is the study of temporal rhythms, and of course they can take a number of forms, but we're primarily interested in the daily rhythms, the 24-hour rhythms, when we speak about circadian rhythms. The word circadian comes from the 2 Latin words circa a dia and diem, which means about a day. So the rhythms have, they repeat approximately every 24 hours. And a circadian rhythm, by definition, is an endogenously driven, roughly 24-hour cycle, and it's observed in biochemical, physiological, or behavioral processes. We're going to go into this in much more detail, of course, but just to get you a little bit of background before we start. And then the other definition is something called chronotype. So you may have heard of the word phenotype before. Phenotype may be that you have brown hair and blue eyes. So chronotype refers to your attributes that are related to your circadian rhythms. And probably the most obvious way to explain that is you may have heard of owls and larks. Owls are the evening types. Larks are those who love to be up early but don't make it too far into the night. And then, of course, the neither types are those that are somewhere in the middle, which we'll discuss a lot more of that in a bit of time. But I just want you to have those definitions in your head. Okay, so where did this circadian rhythm research all begin? Well, there was a gentleman here, Dr. Nate Kleitman, from the US, and he was interested in trying to understand whether or not these rhythms actually persisted in humans, because they had been observed in plants and animals, and the next step was to actually measure them in humans. So to do this, he decided that he needed to be in an environment where he was completely free from any external cues, anything that could give you a hint as to what the time of day was. So how do we do this? We find a cave, of course. This cave happened to be 140 meters below the surface of the Earth. It was completely devoid of any external light, and it was a very consistent temperature, approximately 12 degrees. So he was accompanied down into the caves by his PhD student, this is Bruce Richardson here, and they conducted an experiment in which they put themselves onto 28-day cycles for the period of a month. So they were there between June 4th and July 6th in 1938, and their schedule was such that they were slept for 9 hours, they worked for 10 hours, and they had 9 hours of rest or free time. And then they repeated that every 28 hours. And during that time, they measured a number of biological outcomes, one of which was body temperature, because the thinking was that your core body temperature, if it had a circadian rhythm, it would be reflected in this experiment. And what they found is that there was a 24-hour rhythm in this body temperature. So when they measured it over a 24-hour period, they would see that it would increase during the daytime and it would decrease at night. And it did that with a periodicity of about 24 hours, despite the fact that they were living in a 28-day cycle. And they also noticed that when they tracked sleepiness over 24 hours, that ebbed and flowed in sync with this temperature rhythm. So that was some of the first evidence back in 1938 that we actually have circadian rhythms within our body. What was later discovered was that our free-running circadian rhythm, this would be our natural rhythm if we were living in that cave, was actually just longer than 24 hours. So on average, humans have a natural circadian rhythm of about 24 hours and 11 minutes, so just over 24 hours, and the plus or minus 16 minutes is this good old standard deviation in statistics, which means that for some people, their circadian rhythm is just shorter than 24 hours, and for others, it's actually as long as 24 and a half hours. So it's important to realize that there's inter-individual variation within our circadian rhythms, and that our rhythms change, or they change from person to person, and that they're slightly longer than our light-dark cycle outside. So if we were to look at what this free-running rhythm would look like in an entrained environment, and when we say entrained to the 24-hour day, we mean that we're in a day where we're exposed to light during the daytime, and we're lights out essentially at nighttime. And this is what we call an actogram. These are days of the week. These long 2 days here are Friday night and Saturday night. This would be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And the dark here would be the person's sleep, so going to bed at midnight, waking up for work, having a snooze in on the weekends, I can see, and then being active during the day. So it's a nice, robust, and repeating 24-hour circadian rhythm in sleep-wake behavior. If, however, we were to place this person in the black box or the cave, we would see that they would be a free-running circadian rhythm. So because their natural rhythm is just longer than 24 hours, over the period of just over a month, they would shift unknowingly their sleep-wake cycle until about 35 days later. They're exactly 24 hours out of sync with where they started, but they've synchronized to essentially a new time zone. And that would, of course, be in the absence of the environmental cues, primarily light, but any other social and timing cues. And then, fortunately, if we were to place them back into a normal light-dark cycle, their rhythm would re-entrain to a 24-hour day. So our circadian rhythm, the innate rhythm, is what we say endogenously driven. And it's driven specifically by a cluster of genes which reside in a period or part of your brain. Let's call it, just for familiarity's sake, the SCN, but it's the suprachiasmatic nuclei within the hypothalamus within the brain. So that's really where your master clock resides. What is the master clock? It's an interacting network of clock genes. Those are them. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but what you need to know is that this molecular clock, which I'm guessing that Rahima went over with you yesterday, essentially the genes transcribe for the proteins, and the proteins degrade, and then the gene cycle starts again, and that takes approximately 24 hours. So that's the molecular clock that we're speaking about, which for us is situated in our SCN. Fortunately, because we have a longer rhythm than our natural light-dark cycle, we can entrain our rhythm to the environment by cues that we would call Zeitgebers or time givers. The primary Zeitgeber for our innate circadian rhythm is light, for obvious reasons. So as humans, we have evolved to be super sensitive to natural sunlight, and it's a very, very powerful regulator or entrainer of our circadian rhythm, and I'll go into a bit more detail in that in a few minutes. In addition to light, however, there are a number of other factors which can also entrain our circadian rhythm. These include things like meal timing, the time of day at which you eat. This is critical, and I'm going to cover a little bit more of this in the health and disease lecture, which is in 2 days' time. The time of day at which you are active is also a big prompt to your circadian rhythm to entrain to a 24-hour cycle, as are chronobiotic drugs, so things such as melatonin, anything which is able to phase shift your circadian rhythm. Again, I'll chat a little bit more about that later. And so the output is that we have nice, precise 24-hour rhythms which we can observe on a cellular level in our biochemical processes, physiological processes, and indeed in our behavior. So I'm really hoping that by now you're thinking, okay, well, that's really neat. Isn't biology great? But why in the world do we need to have a circadian rhythm? What's the biological significance? And the key is that if you think back to school, you may well remember the term homeostasis, and it might, if you've, well, let's just go right back to school. So essentially, it's about keeping balance, and it's critical in our body that balance is maintained. We have to have this homeostasis within every aspect of our body. Too hot, and we die. Too cold, and we die. Too much nourishment, too little nourishment. Every aspect of our body has to remain in check, and we call that our homeostatic balance. And so your circadian rhythms are important because firstly, it ensures that the organism, and in this case today we're discussing humans, that we are entrained to our 24-hour light-dark cycle, and that's absolutely critical. It also makes sure that every single system within our body is entrained to the other systems. So it doesn't help for us to be diurnally active, so we're active in the light phase, which is more than likely the time that we're going to eat, yet our gut and our digestive system were active at nighttime. There would be a mismatch between what we're asking the body to do and what it's capable of doing. So I've mentioned very briefly this master clock, which resides in the SCN in the brain. So that's our master pacemaker, which generates our endogenous 24-hour rhythm. And essentially the way that it works is the SCN comprises about 20,000 different neurons, and each one of those cells has its own molecular clock. Remember I said that interacting network of clock genes? So each cell has a little 24-hour rhythm, and then they get coupled together because they're all oscillating. And you can imagine now lots of little people are dancing next to each other, and they all oscillate in time. And so they are coupled together, and so that they oscillate coherently. And this innate circadian rhythm within the SCN is very robust. The only thing that seems to be able to disturb it is light. Not temperature, not anything else, not meal timing, none of the other factors. Only light is able to entrain this rhythm because there is a pathway, it's a non-visual pathway that goes which allows light to travel via the retina to the SCN to distribute the light-dark message to the brain. But it's all very well having this peripheral clock. It needs to be able to communicate with the rest of the body. And so the truth of it is that actually every single cell in your body contains this interacting network of clock genes. So every single cell has its own clock. And there are a number of primary peripheral clocks which can entrain all of these cellular clocks. And this has been shown by taking cells, growing them in culture, and then looking at their 24-hour rhythms. However, each one of these peripheral clocks needs to be coordinated by the SCN. Otherwise, everything would become desynchronized within your body. And the most obvious way to think about desynchronization, we'll chat about it more in a minute, is I'm sure that many of you have traveled east or west and experienced jet lag. Jet lag is the ultimate state of desynchronization, where your body clock is ticking on South African time, but you wake up in Australia and you're 8, depending on sunlight or daylight saving, 8 or 10 hours out of whack. And you need to now resynchronize to that new time zone. So if you can imagine that feeling that you have when you are jet lagged, that is what it feels like to be desynchronized. So essentially, this little gray guy here is the SCN, which is your master clock. It is able to distribute the 24-hour message via your nerves. These are the black lines, essentially, to most parts of the body. But it has a huge amount of help from your primary peripheral clocks. So it communicates directly with the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is important because it produces a hormone called melatonin. And I'm sure that many of you have heard of melatonin or actually used melatonin for a number of reasons. We'll go into that in more detail in a tick. But essentially, melatonin is the primary messenger between the SCN and the rest of your body with regards to whether it is day or night. The SCN also then has a major peripheral clock in the form of the adrenal glands. Their job is to produce corticosteroids, and it's primarily cortisol that they produce, which acts as a very, very strong time giver to your body. And the reason being is that melatonin signals nighttime and cortisol signals daytime to your body. So they have two opposite roles, and they're able to help synchronize the peripheral clocks. So the central clock controls the peripheral clocks directly and indirectly via the nervous system, via various hormones and other signals. So I've spoken a bit about melatonin, and it's critical that I just touch on this a little bit more. It's produced by a gland in your brain called the pineal gland. We affectionately call it the hormone of the night because its production is stimulated by darkness and inhibited by light. So how does that message of light-dark actually travel to the pineal gland? Well, as I mentioned, there are photosensitive retinal cells. These are non-visual cells. They then transmit the light signal or the absence of light to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's your master clock. and then via a bit of a convoluted pathway, don't worry too much, but this is the paraventricular nuclei down to the spinal cord, and then back up to the pineal gland via the superior cervical ganglia. The message comes back to the pineal gland to say, light is present, do not make melatonin. Light is absent, please produce melatonin.
Just interrupt for a moment.
Sure.
You probably will deal with the problem how blind persons develop this problem.
Absolutely. I'm going to get to that in a few seconds. That's a great question. I'm so glad you're thinking about that. Okay, if I were to measure your 24-hour profile of melatonin, so I would do that by perhaps I could take either blood or urine or saliva samples at regular intervals. We usually do it at hourly intervals over a 24-hour period. Then I would get something that looks like this. So this is the concentration of melatonin over here, and this is time of day. This is midnight. This is, sorry, I lied. This is lunchtime, this is midnight, and this is lunchtime the next day. So melatonin levels are super low, almost undetectable during the daytime. And then in the evening, the pineal gland begins to produce melatonin at a point that we name dim light melatonin onset. So it's when light levels drop below a certain threshold, then the message to start to produce melatonin starts, and the levels increase during the night, peak in the middle of the night, and then drop down to daytime levels in the early morning. And the duration of this peak actually reflects the length of the night. So it's actually a very important marker for seasonal changes. Because just as a little aside, you'll probably notice that your sleep patterns, excuse me, I've got hiccups, may well change from summer to winter. Sometimes we can have a shorter sleep period, a later bedtime, and an earlier wake time in summer. And we tend to have a slightly different pattern in winter with an earlier bedtime, later wake time, or we'd like a later wake-up time because it's dark and cold. And partly that's because your melatonin hasn't started to drop yet in the early hours of the morning because the sunlight hasn't begun to kick in. Anyway, digress. So this daily profile of your melatonin concentration is used internally by your body for temporal organization related to 24-hour and indeed seasonal patterns. So the function of melatonin in the absence of light, it's an output signal of your body's clock, and it can either directly drive rhythms or entrain peripheral oscillators. And so essentially it's an enabler. It lets the SEN distribute the daylight message to the rest of the body, to any cell that has melatonin receptors, which as far as we can tell is practically every cell in your body. All right, so now let's look at circadian rhythms and body function. So we can observe these 24-hour rhythms in practically every single aspect of our body. Our sleep-wake cycle is obviously a big one. You can see it in body temperature, hormone release, time of day at which we want to eat, our hepatic metabolism, urine volume and pH, blood pressure, heart rate, and of course physical and cognitive performance. Just to show you a little bit more for each one of these, with our sleep-wake cycle, there's obviously a time of day where it's our natural wake period. Most of us are happy to be awake more or less from when the sun is up until when the sun goes down, or a little bit later. And there's a natural sleep period for our body, and that's driven almost entirely by your innate circadian rhythm. There is a concept of buildup of sleep pressure, which obviously is going to change that profile a little bit, but we'll chat about that. I think that's tomorrow. So if I were to put you in a laboratory, preferably in a nice dark laboratory with very little light, and over 24 hours I were to measure various aspects of your physiology, I would get nice, robust 24-hour rhythms. Of course, in ambulatory conditions, so day-to-day, things change. I might climb a flight of stairs, which is going to change my heart rate. I might exercise, I might be eating, and all of these things can have an effect. But what we know is that under these laboratory conditions, we have very nice, strong profiles. And the key here is that if you're going to be measuring things like blood pressure or heart rate or temperature, time of day at which you make these measurements is really important. So if I were to put a 24-hour blood pressure cuff on you and measure your blood pressure for 24 hours, your average might be, for your systolic blood pressure, 115. But the lowest while you're asleep might be as low as 85. And the highest as high as 135. So you can see how measuring things at different times of days can get you in a little bit of trouble if you don't repeat the measurement at the same time of day if you're using that information for diagnostics. So just to look at what that would look like, this would be your blood pressure 24-hour profile. there's quite a lot of random variability in it because of the disturbance with blood pressure as we move around throughout the day, become stressed or less stressed, for example. But you can see ultimately this 24-hour pattern here. So this is blood pressure, millimeters per mercury. The top line is systolic and the bottom is diastolic blood pressure. This here is time of day. This is midday, this is midnight, and that's midday the next day. So we plot it as a double plot so that you can look at the 24-hour cycle. And you can see that blood pressure is higher during the daytime. It decreases while we sleep to resting values, and this is where our cardiovascular system does a lot of its restoration. And we have this big cortisol awakening response which shoots up blood pressure in the morning to get us going for the day, and then it drops off as the day goes by. We see a very similar pattern here for heart rate, highest during the daytime, decreasing while we're sleeping and increasing as we wake up and throughout the rest of the day. So your heart rate is actually highest at the end of the day and lowest at about 2 or 3, maybe 4, depending on your body clock in the morning. Similarly, we see this for body temperature. This is a very, very robust marker of your circadian rhythm. Body temperature is hugely protected. You can see that the variation over a 24-hour period here is only 1 degree. Because so many of our systems are sensitive to body temperature, it cannot be allowed to change any more than that. And we see here that body temperature is lowest at about 4, 5, 6 in the morning, and it increases throughout the day and peaks just before we go to sleep. And I'm sure some of you have had that sensation where you might have had a hottish night, and then at about 4, 5, 6 in the morning, you suddenly feel a little chilly. You try and cover up a bit more with your blankets or your duvet, and that's because your body temperature then is reaching its nadir or its lowest point. Melatonin, you've seen this too, has a lovely 24-hour profile, as does cortisol. Remember, cortisol is the opposite pattern to melatonin in that it's very low during sleep. There's a big cortisol awakening response here in the morning to get us going, and then it decreases as the day goes by, even though it's spiked by eating. It's got to do with storing food from a metabolic perspective, so don't worry too much about that. But you can see that the influence of each meal becomes less and less as the day goes by. Okay, so it's ultimately all about rhythm. The time of day at which we're hungry and we need to eat has a 24-hour rhythm. The time of day at which our mind is hyperactive or very busy or able to handle numbers, hormone release. The time of day at which we can run the fastest has a 24-hour rhythm, as it does our accuracy with things like tennis serve. Can you imagine that's actually been measured? And so essentially, if we were to look at these highs and lows in a little 24-hour schematic here, we would see that we have a very sharp rise in blood pressure in the morning. I've mentioned that. We'd stop melatonin secretion at sunrise, most likely to have a bowel movement sort of early morning. Highest testosterone secretion is around 9, and high alertness is around 10 o'clock, so it's a great time to be learning, to be in class. We think we have best coordination in the early afternoon and fastest reaction time in the later afternoon, and early evening, greatest cardiovascular efficiency and muscle strength. Blood pressure and temperature peak in the early evening. We start to have melatonin secretion at sunset. This is obviously a little bit later than what we would see in South Africa. Bowel movements are suppressed, thankfully, during the night, and we have our deepest sleep during the night and lowest body temperature in the morning. Okay, so that's the biological part of your circadian rhythm and how we can measure and observe it within your body. But again, that's great. All that you require is for everything to function well, because we don't really pay too much attention to our bodies unless things go wrong. But probably something that you can relate to a little bit more is something called chronobehaviour or your chronotype. So I'm sure you've heard of morning and evening types, and you probably identify yourself with either being a more morning person or a more evening person. So the morning person is that very chipper person in the morning who's always up for breakfast, easy to get up early, full of energy, and when they happen to come into contact with their owl counterpart in the morning, that's the grump, the one who doesn't really want to be there. Whereas at the end of the day, the little lark has completely faded and looks like the party pooper, and as far as the owl's concerned, he's just getting going. So it's not quite as simple as having people categorized as owls and larks. It's nice and easy to study, and it's very easy for us to make definitions like that. But the truth is there's actually a spectrum of chronotypes. We use a specific tool in our research to measure it, not to worry too much about what that means, but what it does is essentially creates a spectrum based on a questionnaire that you complete, which has been validated against physiological measurements. And if I were to measure it, a sample of 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, I would get a little, I would get a little bell-shaped curve like that, whereas people with lower scores would be classified as the definite evening types and highest as the morning types. But actually most people are, most people are somewhere in the middle here in what we call neither types. So they've got early tendencies, they have late tendencies, and they're not too extreme. Those extreme phenotypes are actually quite rare, and it's very difficult actually for them to function highly in our 24-hour light-dark cycle because their innate body clock is so naturally out of sync with the 24-hour world. It's important here that I just also mention that your chronotype is also influenced by age. So you'll know little kids tend to be a little bit more biased towards the morning type. They're often the ones that are up super early, irritating their parents at 5:30 in the morning. As they become teens, they shift towards becoming owls, and that's a very natural tendency. And then as you age, you stabilize to whatever your adult chronotype is supposed to be. And then there's generally a shift again towards morningness as we age. So with older age, people tend to find that they become more morning type. And I believe it's incredibly frustrating. I hear from retired people, but I don't have to get up for work anymore. I have time, and my body, it wakes me up at 5:36 in the morning. And there's no reason. But actually, that's their body clock at play. And that's that shift that's happening in their innate circadian rhythm.
The numbers at the bottom.
That's based on the score from the questionnaire. So they just place you into categories. Sorry, I should have explained that. Yeah, but we won't do the questionnaire, so let's not worry too much about that. But essentially, what I'm saying is that you're on a spectrum somewhere based on your score. Okay. Gender also seems to play a role in chronotype for some reason. I'm not exactly sure what the evolutionary purpose of this, but it seems that females tend to be slightly more morning-oriented than males. And in terms of ethnicity, we also notice very strong differences between different ethnic groups. So for example, in South Africa, we notice that our black South Africans tend to be quite a lot more morning-oriented than some of the Caucasian South Africans. But even within the Caucasian ethnicity, we notice that within South Africa, the white South Africans are a lot more morning-oriented than, for example, the Spanish Caucasians. So there's definitely cultural aspects at play, and there are genetic aspects which are related to ethnicity as well. Anyway, that's a huge, long debate and story which I'm not going to go into. What is nice to understand is that this chrono behavior is actually driven by your innate circadian rhythm. So I'm almost an extreme morning type, and my brother is definitely an owl. And growing up, I just thought he was the laziest git ever, because in my mind, he was never up on time. He was always dragging his feet in the morning, and he was faffing around at night doing goodness knows what when he should have been getting his sleep. Turns out he couldn't actually change that. That was just his body clock at play, and that he is just a more of an extreme evening type compared to me. So remember I said that most people have a rhythm, or the average human rhythm is 24 hours, 11 minutes. What's been shown is that larks, the morning people, are what we call phase advanced. So their rhythms are shorter. So they're closer to that 24-hour mark, whereas owls are what we call phase delayed, and they have the longer rhythms. And so now I think you might be able to appreciate why it is that morning people are able to get up earlier than larks, because their melatonin comes down earlier, their body temperature goes up earlier, and they're more primed to be awake at the earlier part of the day. And at the end of the day, their body temperature is dropping, their melatonin is going up earlier, and they are not at all primed to be awake. Their body is strongly begging them to go to sleep. Let me just show you what that looks like in terms of body temperature. So in this particular study here, they measured body temperature over a 24-hour period, and then they plotted it against time. And they took the 10 males that have the latest chronotype. So these were the 10 extreme night owls, and these are the 11 extreme early birds. And what you'll notice here is that they both have this 24-hour rhythm in their body temperature, but the timing of the rhythm is different. So for the lark, that's the morning person, their body temperature begins to drop at about 9 in the evening, which would correspond to the time of day at which they start to feel tired and ready to go to sleep. Compare that to the owl, their body temperature stays elevated until midnight. So asking the owl to go to bed here, on their graph it's over here, their body temperature hasn't started to drop, which means that the 24-hour light-dark message of it's time to go to sleep hasn't been sent around to their body. They're not at all ready to go to sleep. At the same time, the lark will have a body temperature rise starting at about 4 o'clock in the morning, which explains why they're able to be up at 5 or 6 in the morning without any difficulty. And you compare that to the poor owl, whose body temperature remains low until about 9 in the morning. And so often when I give this lecture to the second and third year students, I'm sitting here with a bunch of evening types, and it's an 8:15 lecture, and their body temperature hasn't started to rise. So it's a slight problem when it comes to concentration. All right, and so we can see that there are phase differences in many of our biological functions between owls and larks, which is lovely because it means that that owl is not just a lazy git. He is driven to be alert and awake at the end of the day. And so you'll get the best out of that owl by allowing them to be productive and to work when they feel creative and productive. Yeah.
Can you manipulate that?
Okay. So you can't really change the biology very easily, but you can manipulate the behavior. We call it conditioning to some extent. So do you remember I showed you that spectrum from super night owl to the super early bird? You can move a little bit along that spectrum, but only relative to where you started at, relative to what your genetics are asking you to be. So through habitually waking up early and habitually shutting off light early in the end of the day, you can slowly make your rhythm to more similar to that of an early person. But you will never entirely shift it, because you're always, what you're doing is every single day you're just re-entraining that rhythm to a new rhythm. So it requires resetting on a daily basis. So it's difficult, but it can be done. I often hear of people who went to the army in their late teens, early 20s, and they say because of that incredibly vigorous early awakenings, very busy days, very high intensity energy expenditure during the day, that helped them to become more of a morning type, and then that persisted on into adulthood, even though they knew that they were actually more of an evening type. So there is a way to condition to some extent, yeah.
Can people have like early morning and late night and then lull in the afternoon?
Yeah. So when you look at the neither types, those are the people in the middle. Those are actually, it's a really nice place to be because you have a bit more flexibility. You can cope with the early mornings, although you might not choose to always be consistently early, and you can deal with the later nights. Whereas when you're extreme, an extreme owl, asking an extreme owl to be up at 6 in the morning, it's murder. So it's actually quite good to be somewhere in the middle. That afternoon dip that you refer to actually happens to all of us. We just fight against it in different ways. What she's referring to is that sort of siesta period after lunchtime. So many of you might recognize that sense of fatigue that tends to creep in somewhere between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. And what's happening there is your fatigue or sleepiness is accumulating throughout the day, and your circadian system has to then put in a big burst of alerting activity to help you stay awake and get through that period to make it through to the evening. And then often you feel like you get a bit of a second wind in the evening. You think, oh, cool, well, that sleepiness is gone, I'm ready to go now. And that's very much the circadian alerting system which has kicked in then. So 1, 2.
So presumably this is still within the limits of normal variation. So the question is, when does that become a sleep disorder? And the question I really want to ask is that I've read that people with autism have an impairment of the clock gene and have problems with sleep.
Yeah.
Is this all controlled by the clock gene?
Yeah, largely. That and melatonin. So let me ask you, just go to your first question, is when does this become a sleep-wake behavior disorder, a sleep disorder? So the DSM has now classified extreme morning types as having what is called advanced sleep-wake phase disorder, and extreme night owls as having delayed sleep-wake phase disorder. And so those are actual medical conditions which are driven by these extreme biological clocks. So just for an example, a person with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder will have a body clock that is very long and it'll probably be well over 24 and a half hours. And their natural waking time would be closer probably to midday, but every day they've got to try and pull that in so they can fit into some kind of a normal 24-hour cycle. And so usually the way that those types of disorders are treated is through melatonin. It's because that's a phase shifter, it's a chronobiotic drug, and so we tend to use melatonin in those cases to try to signal to their body earlier that it's time to prepare for sleep or wake up on the other side of things. In terms of autism, there's some research that has been done which shows that autistic children very often display more of an evening type chronotype, and they often have they struggle with early bedtimes, and so parents often struggle to instill a nice, robust 24-hour sleep-wake cycle in the children, and so then often they then start to accumulate sleep debt because it's difficult for them to be up in the mornings. And we think that is primarily driven through changes in the clock itself, but also in relation to melatonin, and whether it's insensitivity to melatonin, which has got to do with receptors, or whether they're unable to produce melatonin, or whether the light signal is not reaching there. We don't know where in that pathway or cascade it's happening, but it certainly seems to be melatonin related, because when they use melatonin as a supplement, they're able to establish a slightly improved 24-hour rhythm. Okay.
Question was what you probably will discuss that later. The daylight differences in tropical areas and temperate zones.
Yeah.
Is different, the influence of that.
Yeah, it is huge, and humans have evolved to be sensitive to these differences in light exposure through a number of mechanisms. But obviously, in the tropical or equatorial region, we have a lot more consistent light signals throughout the year. Whereas if you are living in the Nordic regions, for example, you have huge changes in light exposure. And that is massively impactful in terms of physical health and mental health. So there's a disorder called seasonal affective disorder, which is directly related to the amount of light. And it generally manifests in the winter months when there isn't enough natural light exposure. And the way that is often addressed is through artificial light exposure and use of melatonin at the same time. Cool. Okay, I just want to check the time. Cool, we've got some time still. We're going to have to vickle there. Okay, and then just to say that I don't want to go into the details of it, but this whole chronotype or this circadian behavior that I've been speaking about is also driven by our clock genes, because they've done genetic association studies to show that variants within some of our clock genes, and variants specifically within these clock genes, don't worry about the details, are associated with chronotype. So a variant within a gene can be just one change in the DNA, which can then change the way that a protein behaves. And so, for example, within the period 3 gene, there's a particular polymorphism, don't worry about the name of it, but essentially, if you carry the 4 allele of this polymorphism, you are more likely to have owl-like traits, and if you carry the 5 allele, you're more likely to have lark-like traits. And I won't go into the details of it, but there's a number of other studies which have also linked clock gene polymorphisms with being either more morning or evening-oriented. So as I said, the take-home message there is that it's very much driven by your innate circadian clock. All right, so what happens when we disturb our circadian rhythms? So essentially, circadian disruption is when your endogenous rhythm becomes desynchronized or disassociated from your external cues. So that leads to desynchronization, and we can observe that in every single system which obviously has a 24-hour rhythm. So we can see it in our physical, physiological, psychological systems. One of the primary things that happens that we'll notice are changes in our sleep-wake cycle, and one of the primary symptoms of circadian dysrhythmia is poor sleep. And so for this very reason, circadian disruption and sleep disruption are incredibly tightly linked. In fact, it's almost impossible to think circadian without thinking sleep. So the two go hand in hand, and I'm going to discuss sleep a little bit more tomorrow and show how the circadian system controls sleep and how the two are very tightly linked. But essentially, if you disrupt a circadian rhythm, think transmeridian travel, going to Australia or to New York, what is the primary thing that you feel at first? Sleep deprivation and inability to sleep at the correct time of day. By the same token, if you disrupt sleep, you actually also disrupt your body clock. But we'll do that in 2 days' time. All right, so what are the typical causes of dysrhythmia? I've mentioned transmeridian flight. Shift work is another very obvious one, where people are required to work at a time of day when their body is primed to be asleep. And I mean, that's just an entire can of worms going down that sort of path, but there's a huge amount of evidence which shows that people who are on either permanent shift work or even rotational shift work have chronic circadian disruption, ultimately leading to chronic sleep disruption, and the metabolic and other health consequences down the line are really quite severe. Blindness, as we had mentioned earlier, is also a cause of dysrhythmia. In cases where thanks to the condition which has caused the blindness, light is unable to travel to the SCN, then a person will have that free running rhythm. Do you remember that rhythm that I showed you that shifts every single day? That is what they will experience because they are unable to re-entrain their circadian rhythm by light on a daily basis. And you can expose them to bright light to your heart's content, and it's never going to help entrain their rhythm. Rather, you need to use some of the other cues like physical activity and meal timing, and of course melatonin, to help create a more robust circadian rhythm if you are suffering from blindness. We also find that as we age, we become, we have more circadian disruption. There are a number of theories that go around that. Potentially, the pineal gland is starting to calcify, and perhaps it can't produce enough melatonin. Perhaps it's not sensitive enough to the light-dark signal anymore. Potentially, the cells within the body are less sensitive to melatonin, unable to make receptors. I mean, there can be a number of factors, and the jury is still very much out. But what we do notice is that the body clock starts to go more awry as we age. Seasonal affective disorder we've also just chatted about, and we've also mentioned the advanced and delayed sleep phase disorders, which are also causes of dysrhythmia, and bipolar disorder as well. So it's very interesting. If you think about many of the major psychiatric conditions, almost every one of them seems to go hand in hand with a sleep issue of some sort. And it's very interesting to me that the two are so tightly connected, and the evidence is still being collected as to whether a sleep disorder precipitates, or a circadian disorder precipitates the condition, or whether the condition precipitates the sleep disorder. But they are very closely linked. And the new thing the new kid on the block is something called social jet lag, which I'm just going to spend 2 minutes explaining because I think it's really worth understanding. But what I want you to understand is that in almost all of these cases here, there's a common theme which is causing the dysrhythmia, and that's exposure to light. And so for most cases, circadian disruptions are exacerbated or precipitated by inappropriate light exposure. So social jet lag has been dubbed an autocircadian disease, where there's a mismatch between the 24-hour light-dark cycle and then your sleep-wake behavior. So it's a person who's choosing to live a sleep-wake cycle that doesn't fit in with our natural 24-hour light-dark cycle. And so what ultimately happens is they become chronically sleep-deprived because they're not meeting their sleep needs. And so really what's happening is, if you think about it, we've evolved to be active when the sun is up and inactive when the sun goes down. But thanks to artificial light at night, we've extended our daytime. So now we can stay up later and be more productive, but we're actually shifting our body clock by doing that, and we're going against when our body would have preferred us to have shut down for the day. But because we need to get to work the next morning, we're shifting our rhythm, but we're also cutting off our sleep opportunity, and we're ending up with a shifted body clock, but also sleep deprivation. Okay, so this is, I love this image. This was taken by satellites which did numerous orbits around planet Earth to look at what our planet should look like at nighttime. So ultimately, you would have thought that we look like this and that we were darkness, but we twinkle like a star. thanks to all of our light at night. And even down here in Cape Town, we're pretty bright. So this light is coming from convenience lights, our city street lights, the street lights outside our house, and now the light is creeping inside. It's not just our televisions, but not just our screens anymore, but it's these wretched phones and devices which are getting closer and closer to our noses. And the thing is that light is a thing of convenience, and it's a thing of urbanization and industrialization, but it's having huge consequences now that we really need to pay attention to. I put as a recommended reading here The Promise of Sleep by William Dement, and if any of you are interested in sleep and circadian rhythms and would like to read it, he's the godfather of sleep medicine, and he writes this book so beautifully that although it's a book in which you're supposed to be learning, he tells the stories in such an amazing way that you don't really feel that you're reading a textbook. And so he writes here that our loss of sleep time and natural sleep rhythms is the tragic legacy of a single profound technology advance, the light bulb. So he's blaming Thomas Edison, absolutely. And he said his light bulb, patented in 1880, effectively changed or overrode the natural order of the world, creating new environmental patterns of light and dark that have often played havoc with sleep patterns. Just as an aside, and hopefully in 2 days' time you'll see why this is funny, Thomas Edison regarded sleep as a waste of time, so he tried to minimize it as much as possible, which is clearly why he developed the light bulb. He actually used a polyphasic sleep cycle. There's quite a lot of interest in that today, actually. That's a nap-orientated pattern where he did 20-minute naps every 4 hours. I just want you to notice that and come back to me in 2 days' time. Okay, so why am I going on about light and why is it so important? So just to remind you that light travels from the retina to the SCN and then via a very convoluted path to the pineal gland to produce melatonin, which then essentially communicates to our body, light, dark, sleep-wake phase. It dictates your sleep. And also, if I remind you of what this profile looks like, where we should be having this lovely big peak of melatonin when it's dark, the question is, what happens to this profile when we're exposed to light? On one hand, if you're exposed to full spectrum light, that's 2,500 lux of light, that's equivalent to outdoor sunlight. It contains a lot of blue light and it's incredibly bright. You're actually able to completely suppress this peak. Now, that's a good thing, because when we travel across time zones, if we couldn't do that, we'd never adapt to the new time zone. But we don't typically expose ourselves to full sunlight in the middle of the night because we just don't have access to it. What we rather do is expose ourselves to lower intensities of light. So domestic light is somewhere between 100 and 150 lux. And what that is able to do, it can partially suppress, so it brings this level down, but it also moves this point that way. It shifts our rhythm. So it shifts that time of day at which we will signal to our body that it's time to sleep. I must just quickly note that that the nature of the light is very important. So obviously visible light, we have longer wavelength light, which is warmer in color, and shorter wavelength light, which is cooler in color. And we have evolved to be very, very sensitive to short wavelength light, outdoor light. So anything in this area over here. So this is what a spectrum of daylight would look like, and you can see that the maximum composition of the light comprises primarily short wavelength light. So blue light really is what you probably would have heard it called. This is what candlelight would look like. So think about firelight. So very little blue light and a lot more orange and red light. Those are fluorescent light bulbs. They've got more peaks in the longer wavelengths. Halogen lights we don't have anymore. Cool white LEDs, which are now going up into homes all over the place, have got a huge spike of blue light. So the message there would be that you wouldn't want to have exposure to cool white LEDs at the end of the day if you battle to fall asleep. Whereas warm light LEDs are shifted and they have much more green light or longer wavelength light, which is a more appropriate light to be exposed to at night if we need to be exposed to light. Okay, so in this experiment, they said, well, let's see what happens if we expose individuals to artificial light at night by allowing them to read for 4 hours before bedtime, which is potentially a work period or what we would experience at the end of the day after work. And they did that for 5 consecutive nights, i.e. just 1 week. And they were given either a Kindle-type device to read from, or they were allowed to read via lamplight and a good old paperback. And what did they find? The e-reader book were less sleepy in the evening and took longer to fall asleep. So just the nature of what you are reading from changes your perception of sleepiness and delays the time in which it takes you to fall asleep. That's huge. It also suppressed their melatonin levels and delayed that dim light melatonin onset. So if that should have happened at around sunset, it pushed it out too much later. They had less REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep, which I will explain tomorrow why that's really important. But essentially, it's the type of sleep that is associated with dreaming, and it's when we do most of our psychological recovery and repair. So it's absolutely critical. And they also felt more tired the following morning. So the key is,
Where does television fit in there?
good question. So television is considered obviously it emits light, so you are exposing yourself to artificial light at night, but proximity to your nose is key. So overhead lighting is optimal compared to television, which is a little bit closer, and the biggest culprits are your screens that you have close to in your hands. So the proximity of the light, because the further the light away is, the more it dissipates before it reaches the retina. So if you're sitting in a room, with all the lights off and just the television on, and the television is a couple of meters away, that's a better choice than sitting in a room with your device in front of your nose or with your overhead lights on. Yeah.
There's another question, but sunlight doesn't contain other radiation which might be absorbed by the body and has an effect, whereas artificial light is completely different.
It is different, but we don't think that the UV light. So let me put it like this. That's actually an entirely. Yeah, exactly. That's an entirely different question, and of course, long-term exposure to that is very harmful. But we have evolved to have at least pulses of exposure to bright light, specifically in the mornings, which helps to reset our clock. Yeah. Okay, sorry, there were quite a few, so I'm going to go there and then there.
Sorry, can you just flip back one?
Sure.
Thanks, Rena.
Is there any known reason why fluorescent lights might put one to sleep?
Not that I'm aware of. Does anyone else know?
Can't hear the question.
Is there any known reason why fluorescent lighting might put one to sleep? Where did you hear that?
I experienced it.
Okay. Unless it's got... The only thing I can think of, I've never heard that and I've never read any research on it, but if it affects you, then it's clearly a thing. Unless it's got to do with the pulsing of the light, the way that the light is delivered, it could be slightly hypnotic. That would be my best guess, but that's completely unscientific. Sorry. Yeah.
Somebody in the lecture yesterday mentioned a screen that you can put over your cell phone.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing? Does it work?
Yeah, it does. So we're going to touch on this in the last day, but I'll just quickly add to it now. You can absolutely filter. So it's unrealistic. Wait, let me show you this next slide, and then I'll explain what I'm thinking here. So if I were to be really silly about it, I would say, but it's so easy to have a healthy body clock. You've just got to have the appropriate light exposure and be active at the right times of the day. So what should we do? We should be seeking morning light exposure, as much outdoor light as we can, because that's going to suppress any residual melatonin which is left in our bodies, and it's going to signal to our body that it's time to get up and go, and we want to be active during the sunlight hours, preferably active in the first half of the day rather than the second half of the day, but there's room for choice there. And then you want to limit light exposure at night, and you want to sleep when it's dark, and you want to eat when the sun's up and not eat when it's dark. It's so easy. I can't understand why people can't do it. But the problem is that life is present and there are demands on our time, and everything's a little bit snowballed in my opinion, and we are in constant communication with one another with work. We're expected to be answering emails immediately, responding to people quickly, because now they can just phone us at any time or drop us a WhatsApp or whatever and expect some kind of response from us. And so we have let life encroach on our rest period, and that's my personal feeling, is that we are extending this day artificially, but sometimes we need to do it. It's not practical to down tools when the sun goes down, especially in winter, because the truth is that we have to finish the work that we haven't done, or we may need to organize some